Welcome, welcome, dear friends. Let us begin. In the name of that divine beloved, out of whose womb of compassion and mercy all things emerge. Welcome to Ray of God. Ray seeks to share feminine spiritual wisdom to help realize God in all ways and to align with justice, truth, and beauty. The energetic state of the feminine is our guiding principle and holds our intention. And we believe that all genders hold the feminine and masculine within themselves. And while we are women-led and women-centered, we welcome and encourage all genders to join us in helping to create safer, more inclusive spaces. So welcome to our third Ray Reads session, our monthly book chat with a fabulous cohort of authors. And our book highlight this month is the fabulous Drums in Our Veins by Karen Georgia Thompson. So I'm just going to read the publishing blurb that comes with this, which beautifully sums up the poems within. Drums in Our Veins is a collection of poems that explore spirituality and identity through the lenses of African ancestors and the realities of African descendant people living in these modern times. Written to the beat of life's drum, these poems are described as resistance poetry by the author. A great read for anyone who is inspired to make social change and is passionate about justice and equality, as well as those looking to be advocates and allies. Drums in Our Veins will take you on an emotional journey of the Black global experience while nurturing your spirit and purpose. I'm absolutely delighted to have Karen Georgia returning to Ray. She's been with us for all our online festivals and also for moon meditations. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen Georgia.
It's always good to be present with Ray of God. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And as I was saying to Karen Georgia just before we began, when this arrived, I wasn't expecting it to be so cute. You can see like my hand, right? It's such a cute little collection. And then you start reading and it's just like, pow, just the, I feel like powerful is such an overused word. There are so many others, but it's just, it is drums. I literally felt the beating of drums as I was reading these poems. And for those of you who know me, I love drums. I love drumming. I play the bendir frame drum in our spiritual circles when we're chanting. And so just the feel of the poetry, I haven't read any poetry that I could feel, that purpose within it. And so I guess I'd like to open up with, this is your first collection of poetry. And how did this manifest and come into being?
That's a good question. So I've been writing poetry for a long time. And I just always took it as, well, just another thing that I did. And over the years, I would write, I would put a poem in a book, I would stick it someplace, but I actually kept them. And it was probably after my mother died that I really started thinking about actually publishing my work. And maybe there's something to be said here about self-worth and how we value the things that are a part of us, because I guess maybe there's also the part about what did I think it was worth to actually share the body of work. So after my mother died, and she passed in April of 2018, I started pulling together poems that I had written probably in a 5-year span, and looking at what it might look like to actually have this as a published collection. So the title of the book actually was inspired by my mother, because that's probably going to be your next question. And I had a conversation with my mother one day, and my mother had dementia, but this was before she really got sick. And she was with me one day, and we were talking, and I was telling her that I had this fascination for Brazilian music. I don't understand Portuguese, never spoke Portuguese, but I have this fascination with Brazilian music. And I said to her, I said, I think it's the drums. And she said, well, she said when she was growing up, they said that there were people who could hear the voices of the ancestors in the beat of the drum. And I thought, and my mother was this very conservative Christian, right? So imagine this moment, I'm walking behind her down the hallway in my house, and she, she says this thing, and I just kind of deadpan to like nobody in particular, thinking like, where did that come from? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, the people said that there are people who could hear the voices of the ancestors in the beat of the drum. And maybe you are one of those people, is what she said. And so the drums in our veins came from this idea that we can hear the voices of the ancestors, that this thing that we carry as blood, and that it has a beat, right, is the voices of the ancestors present. And so somehow I came up with this drums in our veins, that if we can hear the drums, then they're very much a part of our veins. I mean, it's our bloodline. So that's how drums in our veins was born. And when I thought about how I wanted to present the body of work, it starts off with this prologue, and then it kind of goes through this rhythmic flow, and it's really for me like this musical moment that starts and moves through and then has a postlude, but for me it was very much about the possibility that we carried this rhythm very much as a part of who we are, and what it meant for me to hold that, but to also invite others into thinking about this idea that we do have drums in our veins, and that these drums are this beat of our ancestors that we hear and we carry.
Oh, thank you so much. That's, yeah. Everything you said, I feel like you can feel it in your words, in your poetry. And you start off with really fascinating, it's called, is it Africa 101, Africa 100%. And I wondered if you could speak about this, because I think it's fascinating. So I'll let you speak about it.
Yeah, so I have, I was born in Jamaica, that's where my people come from, and I'm okay with that. But I've always felt that I wanted to know where I came from, right? That the enslavement of people in the Americas took from us this idea of connection to where we came from, right? So while I understood my heritage and culture as tied to the Caribbean, and in particular to what it means to be Jamaican, with our variations on curry and callaloo and all these other things, right, that make for good Jamaican food, and how we, the rhythms of reggae and all these other things, right, and our own, version of patois, as language, that wasn't enough. And so I did my DNA. But when I did my DNA, my father was still alive. And so I did my father's DNA, because, what's the sense in doing one, right? I need like evidence. I need like good substantial evidence. So I did my father's, my sister, my brother, and I also did my son. And so that's where I started with this, with the DNA work. And so when I did that, and everybody's DNA came back, My father also had Finnish ancestry that showed up in his DNA, and also Mesoamerican. So I identify, and I acknowledge that these are also a part of who I am. But it was fascinating because I did my sister, and that's not me a second time. That's probably my sister. Yes, there she is, um, who showed up as Karen Georgia Thompson. I did my sister, and hers came back and had like Baltic in her ancestry. But somehow mine came back and it was 100% African. Like there was none of this extraneous DNA. And I don't feel myself better than them or anything like that. But it was just fascinating because we get our DNA from our mothers and from our fathers, and we don't all have the same grouping of DNA that we inherit. And so when we looked at our DNA together, it was fascinating, the percentages that we had and the things that showed up. And I think if there's a regret, it was not having done my mother's before she passed, to get a sense of, kind of the totality of what that looked like. And so this idea of, the poem that's Africa 100 actually was crafted out of a conversation that I had with a friend who's a white male, who said to me, nobody is 100% anything. And so out of that, I wrote this poem, which is actually in part an exchange in conversation with this person, to whom I said, well, I did my DNA and it came back, I'm 100% African, and it represents Nigerian and Kenyan. And I see Phyllis Burdon, and Phyllis was my host when I went to Kenya. And so for me, being able to identify those parts specifically was important for me to understand who I am, where I come from, and also what informs how I understand the world. So I think this idea of drums in our veins became even more alive around the DNA that actually showed up for me, because it was so much African and explained so much about how I understood myself, how I understand myself, and how I move in the world, because I had always been fascinated with Ifa. And how Ifa explains the world, and Ifa also as a form of spirituality that's still alive and well here in the Americas, and Candomblé and Santeria and the variations, and how they've survived. So when I did my DNA came back like more than 50% Nigerian. It made sense because Ifa is very much coming out of Nigeria. And so again, this idea of drums in our veins just meant something deeper and more around even the DNA evidence, so to speak. And it doesn't negate the other pieces and parts that showed up for my siblings, right? But it's just this very strong African presence and African rooting.
Oh, thank you so much. I love the line in Africa 100 where you say, what does science have to do with what the soul knows? Like, because, you have this kind of literal test that we can take, but there's also something deeper. And, one can affirm the other, but one can also say that the soul knows, the soul always knows. And you can find affirmations of that in so many different ways. I said this in my post that I had put on Instagram about reading the book, but I'll say it again here. When I first came across your poetry, it was the year that we were first planning our first Rayfest. And as soon as I read, it was on your blog, I read your poems, and I was like immediately like, okay, she's our kind of fire. Like, absolutely, we have to have you. And I love the conversations that we've had over the years, because it's also kind of the journey that I've also been on, from being, a young British Pakistani girl, kind of rejecting my culture and just wanting to be British and English, and what does that mean for me? And then as I become older, and I hope more, I've gained a little bit of maturity, really feeding into wanting to connect to my heritage. And so all those parts of myself that I actively shunned, now I'm kind of wanting to go back and engage with them. And I have a lot of regret as well, because my great grandparents, I met them when I was 6 and 11. I wanted to see them again, but they passed away. And then I had access to my grandmother, and I always had this, kind of, oh, I want to speak to her. I want to find out more. She would tell me stories about the move, very one story, because during the partition, the people that experienced that, they didn't talk about it. And there's, for those who are aware of the atrocities that happened, there are obviously very clear reasons for that. But she always told me this one story about how my great grandmother, her mother, would take her back to visit family in India from Pakistan. And I'm now left with this. I really want to know where in India the family came from, where in India some of the family stayed behind. And I was thinking last year that I would really like to speak to my great uncle. He's very old now too, and he's in Pakistan, and I need an interpreter to really understand or get my question across through clearly. But I had thought about it last year, and life intervened. And then when I picked this up and I was reading the poetry, it came back to me again. What am I waiting for? Like, these people are here, and ask the questions you need to ask, but also this connecting to the soul. What is it in my soul that's kind of yearning? What does it know? And how can I connect to that in ways that I have this opening that I didn't have when I was young? And who knows how long this opportunity remains. And so, especially Africa 100, I thought, maybe I should do a DNA test too. But, before I do that, I have access to these elders that are still with us, and I should be asking those questions. So I want to thank you for reminding me of this intention that I had made and haven't quite got around to. So I'd like to take this moment to invite you to read a poem, so that folks can experience the drum beats. So I'll allow you to choose whichever one you feel is right for this moment.
And that's hard. Okay, I'll do Broken Sidewalks. And I feel like I'm having a dog ate my homework kind of a moment, because I left my book at home. And one of the commitments that I made to myself was, I'm going to make sure that I always have a copy of my book on my person. And then I walked out the house this morning and left it some reading, not from a copy of my book, but from my iPad. And so Broken Sidewalks. We, inhabitants of time and space, children of lesser gods, brothers and sisters of light, relatives of saints and sinners. We, wounded travelers, building magical moving staircases to fantastical dreams, traumatized healers, mending breaches and fissures. Then as now we rise, then as now we hear the drum beats of tomorrow, then as now we chart a future singing songs without a score, then is now. We, the transcendent, children of the earth, babies formed from tears, visionaries writing on the clouds. We, the mystery of life, living as seeds fallen into the cracks of broken sidewalks, finding soil, pushing deep, shattering concrete. Then as now we flourish, then as now we hold tight to each other, then as now we chant incantations, weaving strength and hope into broadcloth of justice without looms. We, waters flowing free, children of breath, bearers of courage, luminaries of change, marching across broken sidewalks. We, creators of tranquility, children of radiant brilliance, defying obstacles, sidesteppers of defeat, building pathways to our destiny. Then as now we transmogrify, then as now we swim rivers to generational healing. Then as now we dream afloat, riding flotsam, rearranging shards of broken sidewalks into sweeping mosaics of freedom. That's broken sidewalks. And I think broken sidewalks is, I have favorites. And I think it's one of my favorites because, it paints this sweeping picture of possibilities, you know, and calls us into remembering. I think that one of the things about Ifa that I find fascinating and that I really love is the way that Ifa talks about, you know, purpose, that we come with purpose, and that when we're born knowing our purpose, but as we get older, we forget. And that a part of our life's journey is remembering who we are and why we came so that we can live into our purpose. And so, I think for me, that becomes fascinating. And I think the idea of broken sidewalks then as now, and what it means to embrace our brokenness in a way that creates something beautiful and new and meaningful and deep. And, you know, so, you know, it's this idea of rearranging these shards of broken sidewalks into sweeping mosaics of freedom, you know, and what it means for us to experience our lives in that way.
I'm really happy to hear that you said this is one of your favorites, because this is on my list that I sent to you as well. And I think that for me, like with so many of these, but this one I kind of like double highlighted the opening. I just love this idea: the children of lesser gods, brothers and sisters of light, relatives of saints and sinners. It just feels such an encompassing way to connect with creation and each of us. And then towards the end, we swim rivers to generational healing. I feel like that is so present for so many people that are going through some type of healing, whether it's through some type of therapy or within spiritual community. But again, this acknowledgement that we're swimming rivers really wide. And it's not just about us. It's not just about me. It's never about my healing. It is always about generational healing. So, yeah. And so coming back to living our purpose, I feel maybe touching upon your upon your purpose, upon your day job. When we met you, it was okay. There's this amazing spiritual poet who also happens to be pretty high up in the United Church of Christ. And could we take a moment here to just acknowledge that you have been put forward to be the leader of the United Church of Christ? And my question here really is, how have you found blending these roles and merging your purpose in one aspect? One could say very different outer ways, but really at the core of it is one purpose and this one calling of God that you're manifesting in these different ways. How have you found the drum beats within sounding back in these different spaces?
Yeah, I think for a while there, I experienced it as challenging, and in many ways, perhaps even somewhat bifurcating of myself, right? And feeling that there was maybe some sense of tension in what was emerging for me and the way that I was taught, right? So I grew up pretty much in a conservative Christian household, and arrived, I think, at a place in my life where I really needed to step back from church, and experience God in some different kind of way. And I think the major moment for me, and I think I've named it before, somewhere around Rayfest. So was that there was a leader in our denominational context who basically had told me if I left my husband that God was going to kill me. And so that was a particular moment for me. I was in my 20s, and either because I didn't have better sense, or maybe it was the bravest thing that I ever did, I left the church. And in my conversation with God, which happened at 30,000 feet on a plane, basically was, if you're going to kill me, you're not going to find me, because I'm not going to be sitting in a church waiting. But in later years, I thought, like 30,000 feet is not really a good place to have a conversation if you think that God's going to be out to kill you, that maybe that should have been done on the ground. But, but I think for me, it was a moment where I left the church. But I think in coming back and finding my way to more progressive Christian spaces, I think that was just really half of the journey, because I think the other part of the journey was the understanding of myself in the context of the spirits of my ancestors and the traditions that they brought with them into the Americas, and the fact that those were very much a part of who I am. And even though my mother was this really conservative person, I realized that she had raised me in a particular way that caused me to embrace something that I didn't know or understand about myself. So it wasn't until in my later years, and I would say in the last 5, maybe 6 years, that of conversations with my mother, that I found out, for example, that my grandfather on my mother's side was a healer, that he was a traditional healer. And it wasn't until my mother died in 2018 that I had a conversation with my father, and I mentioned to my father that my mother's father was a healer, and understood the plants and just like all these healing elements and things like that, right? That my father, when I said this to him after my mother had died, he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "So was my father." And so that began like a whole other story. But I think a part of the complexity of this, right, is that two people who were married for like over 50 years, right, heading on 60 years, had never talked about this part of themselves. And so I think for me, that was the Christianization that they had embraced, right? That said that these other things were problematized, right? And so I think a part of it for me in this moment is holding space for myself to embrace all of who I am, right? The totality of myself. And what that means is that I'll tell you a story. My mother, a couple of months before she died, one day she looked at me and she said, "Why do you look like you have two heads?" And I talked to my mother in a different kind of way, particularly when she was on her way out. And I said to her, I said, "Is it over here?" And she said, "No." She said, "It looks like it's coming out of your face." And I said, "Well, maybe it's the two traditions that I'm struggling with." I said, "Because I was born with the traditions of my foremothers and forefathers, and I was raised as a Christian, and now, it's coming back, and I don't know what to do." And she said, "Follow the ancestors." She said, "Follow the ancestors. They know what they're doing." Right? And I think it was a very profound moment for me of not trying to figure out, like, do I have two heads or not, but living fully in this understanding and totality of who I am. And I think the other part of that was my mother, particularly in her later years, who talked about the traditions in a different kind of way and helped me to find my way back as she was on her way out. So I think in this moment, as a leader, I'm fully grounded in my understanding of what it means to hold African tradition as a part of my heritage, but also what it means to identify as Christian, right? And that those two are not oppositional, but that they ground me in different kinds of ways and inform fully who I am.
Thank you so much. I'm so heartened is not the right word because it doesn't sound strong enough, but it is the heart. I'm so heartened to know that you are out there in the position of leadership that you are, bringing your whole self, because you're a woman that's leading the way and allowing others to make space. The fact that you've joined us, that you've made so much time for Ray. I know Fatima and I would both say that we see you as a beloved elder, a sister who's showing us ways that we can use our voice. And you said at the beginning about when you put this poetry collection together, you spoke about self-worth. And as I was reading this, I was feeling like part of my healing is trying to name my experience, and I find it very difficult. But because I'm always thinking about the other, the outer gaze, who's going to be looking at what I say, who would even read what I have to say. And such a huge learning for me has been, it's not about the other, it's about me. It's about learning to say it for myself. And reading this beautiful collection, it's re-inspired me to get out my dusty notebook where I was trying to write, trying to find ways of expressing, of clearing the generational trauma and the healing that I need for myself. And I think that the way that you combine, because this is a mix of your experience, the ancestors' experience, a world experience, and you've combined poems of brutality, resistance, hope, and beauty. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I would love for you to be able to read another poem as well. But if you could offer any guidance to those of us who are trying to navigate these treacherous waters of healing, these rivers that sometimes seem quite calm, but then you go a little too deep, and all of a sudden you can be swept away. And coming back to speaking for ourselves, to ourselves, and ways that we can do this.
Mm-hmm. I think being swept away is a perception, and is rooted in our own fear. Because I think if we surrender to spirit is always going to hold us in ways that are gentle and careful, and get us to where we need to be. But I think the first challenge is really finding ourselves. And I keep saying, that our way to spirit is really about dealing with ourselves, right? And that a big part of the challenge for many of us, and I think especially for women, is that there's so much that comes at us in society that it is hard for us to love ourselves. It's hard for us to find worth in who we are. And thirdly, it's hard to value what it is that we're experiencing. So in those moments, even when spirit begins to call, it's hard for us to think that, like, it's the who me, like, we kind of want to look around. It has to be somebody else, right? It can't possibly be me, but it is you. So so what does it mean for us to understand ourselves as being worthy of spirit, being worthy of spirit's time, being worthy enough to carry message and purpose and grace, that, there's so much intention about who we are. And can we allow ourselves that moment of walking with intention, right? That says, I'm spirit filled, and I'm spirit led, and what it means to walk with that kind of certainty, right? That doesn't mean that every single thing is going to be perfect, right? But says that there's something greater than who we are, that informs our presence and our being, and also that there's this interconnectedness of who we are that also allows us, right? So I'm deeply heartened to see, like, so many of my sisters here, right, who journey with me in a variety of ways, right? Who I love, because this is what it means to be on that journey that is authentic, because the people that you end up with around you are the people who need to be around you, right? So sometimes we have lots of people, like, just a whole lot of people, but when it comes right down to it, right, the ride or dies are not there, right? That these are just like a lot of people that So when you begin to value yourself in a different kind of way, then the people who are around you are also people who are valued and value you in a different kind of way as well. And I think that's a part of it. I think that's a big part of it. And I think for me, arriving at this place was about letting go of, a lot of the noise in my head about not having value, about, God's going to kill you if you leave your husband, just a lot of those messages, right, that had just kind of filled me in different kinds of ways, and says, well, if you do this, then something else is going to happen. But when I reconnected and got rid of some of that, it was walking in this moment and being able to say, even in the church, this is who I am. I'm a person who understands and values myself as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, but also as somebody whose life is tremendously informed by world religions and deeply grounded in the traditions of my foremothers and forefathers, which I have no names for because I don't know what those things are, but recognizing that these traditions are important for me. So I want to read Unscripted. And my comment about Unscripted, and I'll talk a little bit about where it came from when I'm done, but I think there's something about accepting this unscripted life that we have, right? That even in the midst of purpose, there's joy in what it means to live an unscripted life, right? And being, kind of spirit led. So Unscripted, there is that day, one amazing day, where time unwinds in stationary restlessness, beckoning. The hours unfurl uninterrupted, soft like moon-kissed petals covered with dew under the early morning sun. Each minute, we are transformed, moments taken in stride, finding laughter amidst strangeness, joy in the mundane. Like waters meandering wistfully through flowered concrete canals, making our way through busy streets, we journey. Invited unknowingly to drink from deep wells, walking the unfamiliar, repeatedly we tread uncharted pathways. Seeking salves for sapped souls, looking for the obvious to mend fragmented lives, we encounter magic in letting go. Our unnoticed emptiness is replenished, gazing at the sacred beauty of existing today, where life finds us. Walking in the sun, we find ourselves unscripted partners, writing memories with mystery. Finding what we did not seek, we rediscover the timelessness of self-renewed. We rid ourselves of brokenness. Remembering we are healed, all we need we find standing in the stillness today. In the end, our hearts replete with wonder, we watch the world go by from neon lighted street corners, grateful. All my poems, because I think it happened because I travel so much. So all my poems are time stamped, date stamped, and indicate like where I was when I wrote the poem. And when I first like really started paying attention to my poetry, even before I started traveling, I would always time and date stamp because I wanted to remember like where I was or what I was doing or what it was that inspired that moment. So this beautiful poem actually came after a day of trying to find a bar in Seoul. And so, you know, we were in a meeting and the meeting broke and we said, okay, let's go find a bar. And we couldn't find a bar. And so we ended up walking all over Seoul this one afternoon, just kind of aimlessly, what felt aimless, but there was something about kind of starting out looking for this bar and then kind of forgetting that we were looking for a bar, right? And just walking and talking with one of my colleagues, right? And being present with life, with no hurry, right? Somehow we figured out that bars don't open before like 6 p.m. But by then we had walked and talked and had really just in this day just allowed life to be. There was this executive session and we couldn't be in the executive session and nobody knew when it was going to end. And so we just started walking around Seoul. So I think this is what came out of that moment. And there was something very sacred about finding healing in the moment, right? That somehow it wasn't ever about, kind of the bar. But it was really about the time that was spent in that moment, reconnecting in the sun, watching the river course by through the canal. It was just this. So this is what came out of an afternoon of walking through Seoul, So anyway, so yeah, and we did find the bar that night, which was appropriate, but that's a whole other story and doesn't have a poem. I believe that some of the best moments that we will ever hold for ourselves are the moments that we allow ourselves to be unscripted, connected to spirit in a way that guides us, right? And I think it's the paradox of being intentionally unscripted, right? So it's possible to live with intention and still be unscripted, right? And that I think is the paradoxical moment that's held.
Wow, thank you so much. That is, I don't have enough time now to tell you how incredibly appropriate that advice is for me right now in my life. I'm really sorry that we didn't have time to take Q&A from all the lovely people that have joined us, but Karen Georgia does have to go on to another meeting at the moment. So I just want to say thank you so much for making the time to join us again. And as always, we look forward to having you join Ray. Already thinking about things that we can do at creative workshops for friends that might be interested in wanting to express their own poetry, resistance poetry. Thank you so much, Karen Georgia.
And thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all.